The hooded sweatshirt version is worn like this, so that way you've got your hood. Then there's another new style, again, that has hit Karamoja, and that is for these young men. And so I mentioned how most of the guys in Karamoja, they sit around most of the time doing nothing, they talk. But nowadays you actually have some of these young men, in addition to doing crocheting, they are out working in the gardens. And so you can see why if you have this blanket on up over your shoulder and you're out doing some physical work, it's just going to fall off, so it's not very practical. So the new style for the young men of Karamoja is to wear the mini skirt. They don't wear a shirt. They wear the Dr. Seuss hat, and they all have a cell phone. And that's the Karamoja men. They're very resourceful people. They're good at repairing things, making things. So if they do wear shoes, most of the Karamojong will have tire shoes. So they make them out of old tires so that the thorns can't penetrate the bottom of their shoes. The men get a little stool like this. So the women and children, they have to sit on the ground, but the men get a little stool. So they might use it as a pillow, but usually it's for when they're sitting around talking for the 7 or 8 hours a day. This is the way they'll sit for literally 7 or 8 hours a day. So if anybody wants to try out the little stool when we're finished, this is the real size, but we don't accept responsibility if you can't get back up again. And then finally, just a little bit about the language. So the Karamojong language was an unwritten language. So there's basically maybe 5 or 10 books actually printed in the Karamojong language. It was the Catholics who have been in the area for the longest period of time, maybe about 60 years or more, who have done most of the work in terms of the translation. And so because it was an unwritten language, they wrote it down phonetically. So it was a group of Italian Catholics, most of them, who did the work, and they did it phonetically. So whatever they heard, they just sounded it out using the traditional Roman alphabet. So for anyone who can read English, it's the same alphabet that we use, except that they do not use X's, Z's, and Q's, and they have one extra phonetic symbol, and that's the letter N with the J tail. And that's the sound So if you think of the word song, that NG at the end is a really common sound in the Karamojong language. So we live in Karamoja, we're working among the we're living among the Karamojong people, and we're trying to learn the Karamojong language. So last year, March of 2011, was when the entire Bible was released in the Karamojong language. So we're very thankful to have this as we do the work there in Karamoja. Questions? Yes?
Seeing as cows are so important, do you actually have any?
So the mission has a policy of not having any cows. So they are very important, but because of that we do not want to be raided. And so the mission does not keep any animals except for chickens. Yes, sir?
Do you have any security problems on your pharmacy and your clinic?
Do we have security problems? So, yes and no. So, the Karamojong culture is one of common property, so you just share everything, basically. And so, for them, if you leave something sitting out, like if we have a water bottle or whatever, and I set it down, and then I walk away from it, well, it's just there. And so that's my fault for leaving it, and if somebody wants to take it home, they don't consider that to be stealing. And so we have to be very careful in terms of our own living compound, but also the clinic, just basically to prevent temptation. We do keep things as well locked up as we can to prevent that from being a problem. So basically in the clinic we don't have much of a problem because we do keep it locked up. I mean, I'm sure some things get stolen, but it's not a major problem.
What about, because I work in the medical industry, what about refrigeration? How do you manage to keep things that have to be kept cold?
So we actually do have refrigeration, and it's done by propane. So in the clinic we've got a refrigerator, and then each of the missionary families has a propane refrigerator, a propane stove, and then we have solar powered electricity. So as long as you remember to change the propane tank every month, you're doing really well. Yes?
What do you have for bedding?
What do we have for bedding?
So we live a pretty comfortable lifestyle, so we have regular beds, but the Karamojong people would sleep on like a cow skin or some other kind of skin and then use those blankets to cover up. So.
Yes.
The villages steal cows from one another? Are they the same villages that share the water?
They would tell us no. They would tell us it's the enemy, the Bokots, who come from Kenya to come and raid them. But the likelihood of them raiding other Karamojong is pretty high. But I have no idea whether they actually do. They swear they don't raid other Karamojong. So probably not someone who shares the same water source. Probably somebody a little bit farther away than that.
Yes.
You mentioned about malnutrition being a problem. Is that because they don't have enough food or they don't eat the right kinds of food?
So malnutrition is probably mainly due to they just have very poor agricultural practices. So they're subsistence farmers, so you'd think that after 1,000 years they would be really good at growing what grows in that area. But it's a culture that's extremely devastated by dependency. So you've got all these aid organizations that pour millions of dollars into Karamoja, and so there's really no motivation to develop or improve because then the aid would stop. And so while they do, they know how to grow things, corn and maize, they do not have a really balanced diet either. And so most of the time it's lots of carbohydrates or lots of alcohol. And so some of it is they don't have enough because they don't want to develop, and some of it is just poor variety in their diet. Yes, sir?
Is there severe drug and alcohol problems then?
So there's severe alcohol problems. Drugs are not a major problem in our area yet. It's becoming more. They all use this snuff thing that we think it's like an amphetamine that keeps them awake, but it doesn't have any psychological effects that we know of. But we are seeing more of we think it's an opioid that really causes psychotic disorders that's much more common in Mbali and Kampala, is starting to get up in Karamoja. But alcoholism is, we have 5-year-olds who are drunk in the clinic, so it's a big problem.
Do they make it themselves, moonshiners?
Well, there are lots of different alcohols available. So they make their own local brew out of sorghum, and it is disgusting. Never tried it. Always denied it. And so it's warm, it's kept over the fire, and at 5:30 in the morning they're calling that's ready. So they drink that from 5:30 in the morning until the time they go to bed at night. So obviously they get drunk off of it. But then there's the bigger problem is the little packets of alcohol. So they have these little itty bitty packets of plastic packets of gin and vodka, and then another alcohol that's called etule, a really strong hard liquor, and that's what causes the problems. So kids, make hats out of the alcohol packets. They make shoes out of the alcohol packets. They're littered everywhere. So the likelihood that anybody can get into it is pretty high. So.
Yes, sir.
Where did the alcohol packets come from?
Southern Uganda, probably. So there's no regulation on who makes it, so there's pretty bad.
One batch could have, a really low alcohol content, and the next batch could have a high. You have no idea.
Yes, sir.
How do they get enough money to afford cell phones?
So money for cell phones. It actually is a couple of reasons. Number one, they're really cheap cell phones. Number two, they buy, instead of buying monthly plans, you can buy it per minute. So they can just have literally cents and can talk for a few minutes. But they get money by, whether it's making hats or selling a goat or a chicken, or if they've got extra corn or whatever produce they have, they can go and sell that to be able to buy their cell phones. So they find ways. Yes?
So prevalence of HIV?
Prevalence of HIV. So in Uganda as a whole, it's a problem much worse than here in the U.S. Maybe not as bad as South Africa or Kenya, but it is a problem. However, where we are in Karamoja, it's not as severe. Mainly, we think because the Karamojong were kind of the shunned people. They're the outcasts of Uganda, and so there's not a ton of interaction between the Karamojong and everyone else in Uganda. So unless you're a Karamojong who's a business person or a soldier who's had lots of interactions, we don't have a big problem of HIV in our area. Yes?
Since when were there cellular towers in Karamojong?
So we've had cell towers now for, 5 years or so. cell phone tower company.
Apparently, cell phones were produced in mass quantity for,
It's a big thing for
it's a big
Africa.
thing for Africa because there's too much land covered with phone lines, so required rapid.
Yeah.
I understand polygamy is a big problem there, and that came to understand from Alvin Terrico that was one of the big reasons they don't have deacon and elder candidates. Is it still prevalent even in the church, and is that still an issue for even finding men who are willing to be monogamous as Christians?
So the question is about polygamy in the church and in the area, and so honestly, most of the church is made up of women and children, so it's hard to find men in general who would come to church. Now, whether that's because we do have a position against polygamy, I think there's lots and lots of cultural reasons, etc., why the men don't come. But yes, it disqualifies them from becoming officers in the church. It does not disqualify them, or at least our missions practice is it does not disqualify them from becoming members of the church, and we do not encourage them to divorce their 10 wives to keep one or anything like that. We do encourage them not to take more wives. We're very thankful for individuals like David and Paul who, yes, they're monogamous, and there's some other men in the church who are, and that's a great example. It's a great light among the Karamojong people, because that's a major change for them. So yes, it's still a problem. Yes?
Okay, snake question. Have you had any black mambas or poisonous snake problems on your compounds?
We have lots of poisonous snakes on our compound. We've never had snake bites among the missionaries, but we do regularly have poisonous snakes, yes.
So we have
Mambas and cobras and puff adders and boomslangs and others.
Lots of unfriendly things.
The Karamojong people hate the reptiles of any kind, and so anytime they see snakes, you just shout out the word for snake and they'll come and kill it for you. Gone pretty quickly. Yes?
How big can a python get? Or do you know?
So a python, we don't see them a ton where we are, so they're actually one of the rare snakes to see in Karamoja. But a python can be 15 or 16 feet long. Well, the ones in our area, I don't think they are. 16 feet.
On the distribution of duty between the men and the women, obviously it's pretty weighted. Through the church's ministry and conversion, does that get redistributed? Do men tend to identify with some new things, or is that a big cultural hurdle that it's odious? How can you possibly expect me as a respectable man to do such a thing? How's that work?
So how does the distribution of labor work out in the church in terms of being between men and women? It's a slow process, but it is a process that has changed. And so, you will have people like, well, let me start again. It is a process, but when there's money involved, it's very easy to get them to change. So if you've got guys who will come and work in the Work for Food program, so they'll go out and do the harvesting and the weeding and whatever, because they're getting paid. So there is a pretty easy shift if it's in terms of money. However, when you see people, again, like David or like Paul, you will see differences in their homes, and you will see differences in terms of what does get done. Now, a lot of times they're with the mission most of the day, and so their wives still get to do most of the work in terms of the gardening and whatever. But there's not nearly the same treatment of the wives in terms of how everybody, the wives are basically property. And so, we've got guys who are members of the church, who will start their own businesses, and they'll be the ones in charge of actually digging the ground and things like that. So you will see changes, and some of that is in the church, some of that there's also influences from other people in Uganda. Just men do some work in Uganda nowadays, so there are changes, yes. That was kind of a convoluted answer, but there are changes, so. Yes?
Do wives equate status?
Do wives equate status?